My name is Halima. I'm the chair of the Inclusive Mosque Initiative, and I'll be basically introducing what's happening today and then leaving the stage for our fantastic keynote speakers and then our further presentations and workshops in the afternoon. So this is the third installment in the Raise Your Gaze series that the Inclusive Mosque Initiative has been running since September last year. And essentially, this series of workshops, Raise Your Gaze, was really about unpacking really critical issues for the Muslim community, and especially for marginalized Muslims in this country and wider. And we've been so overwhelmed with the support from people coming to these events, sharing them on social media, and from the speakers and workshop leaders that we've had come and work with us and join us. And the third Raise Your Gaze is no exception. And so, though the title may be about Islamophobia, which is maybe something that, again, getting you out of bed on a Saturday morning to talk about something that is a very difficult, painful topic, we are hoping that this event will leave you feeling inspired and helping you build resilience and helping you really think about how you can take action against this growing issue that's facing us. So today we're exploring Islamophobia, not singular acts of discrimination, but as a structural phenomenon. And of course, it's really significant for us as a mosque to be talking about this, and particularly for an organisation like the Inclusive Mosque Initiative, where the experiences of those who are most marginalised and those who are most under the spotlight is really important to be discussed and to be highlighted. So I ask that you could be respectful of those amongst you today, be respectful of people's lived experiences, and listen with compassion and thought. So to run you through the format of the day, so we've got our first session, which is a keynote speech, followed by Q&A. We've then got lunch in the hall, which is just here. And then we've got further workshops in the afternoon that I'll be talking you through in a second. Just to let you know, so the bathrooms are, there's two toilets as you come in on the left-hand side here, and there's further toilets at the back of the hall and to your left. And all of the toilets are gender neutral, and there are wheelchair accessible bathrooms as well. There's an induction loop in this room, so if you want to turn your hearing aids to T, that will have the induction loop working and having you accessing the sound in the best way. We have a BSL interpreter in the room, and if you need BSL support in your workshop, can you please let us know? We've also got a children's corner in the main hall, as well as a library in the hall, and you'll see it as you walk sort of towards the back of the hall. And there are books that should help you in your journey to unpack and think more about the topic of Islamophobia. As you may have also noticed, there are a film crew in the room, and we have a photographer today. So if you feel uncomfortable at all about being in video or being in photos, please let the photographer and the videographers know. Could you just raise your hands so people are aware who to let? Yeah. So if you want to do that now, feel free to scramble and speak to WASI or speak to FFS about that. So I think, fire exits. So you can see the green signs above your head. So if there is a fire alarm that goes off, please take it seriously. Please look after those around you and please exit as safely and as quickly as possible. So this is the best part of this introduction. It's to be able to introduce our keynote speaker. So Suhraiya Jivraj. Dr. Suhraiya Jivraj is an activist academic, senior lecturer in law based at the University of Kent, and coordinator of the Decolonising Sexualities Network. She's an author of a number of publications and teaches modules in public law and race, religion and law, and leads on working towards the anti-racist university in the UK. She's co-founder and former coordinator of the SAFRA project and has worked for a number of anti-discrimination and human rights organisations from grassroots to the UN. Her work draws inspiration from and contributes to critical race, religion studies, gender, sexuality and Islam, and post-decolonial perspectives, particularly from the global south. We also wanted to mention that she's part of the pension strike at her university. And if you don't know anything about that, please have a look online, have a look on social media, and give your support in any way that you can. So I'm going to stop talking very soon. I also wanted to quickly introduce Latifa, who is on the stage as well with Dr. Suhraiya. Latifa's going to be leading the Q&A session, and please get involved in that Q&A session. So after 45 minutes of the keynote, we'll then open it up to Q&A, and please get involved and just, share your thoughts and experiences, and the floor is really open to you. It's as much your day as it is an event put on by the Inclusive Mosque Initiative, so thank you so much for being part of it. So I am going to, I'm going to stop there and I'll pass over to Suhraiya. Thank you so much.
Right, so Assalamu alaikum and hello. Thank you so much to IMI for inviting me, particularly Lina and Tamsila, who unfortunately couldn't make it because of the weather conditions. But Tamsila, if you're watching, miss you. And I just want to start by saying how wonderful and what a privilege it is to be part of the IMI initiative and to have had the opportunity to be one of the first people to pray in front of a woman imam alongside Tamsila. And I'm so glad from that moment, which was quite a few years ago, to where it is now, to see where it is now. It really warms the heart and the cockles. Okay, so I was given a brief, which I firmly rejected and said, that's way too much to do. So I've kind of put my own slant on it. But the brief was essentially to talk about Islamophobia in the context of the logics around Islamophobia, the state logics around Islamophobia. So that's what I'm going to be trying to deal with. So the premise of my talk today, I just have to work this. Yay. So the premise of my talk today is a simple one, and that is that Islamophobia is, and always has been, a manifestation of racism, or what I will refer to as racialization. And I will give an explanation about what I mean by racialization on the next slide. But essentially, it's something that I will talk about that resulted from Euro-imperialism. Not just from the colonial period, but going all the way back to the Crusades. And you can see there from the first picture on the slides that that covers a period roughly between 1096 and 1204. And as I said, I will be focusing on the role of the state, what is referred to as structural racism, actions of state actors and institutions and law and policy that flow from that. There are, of course, other social actors involved in racism and racialization, and I'll say a bit about that when I come to the next slide. So let us be clear. Islamophobia, in my view, is not a new post-9/11, 7/7 phenomenon, or even a consequence of late 20th century events like the Salman Rushdie affair, for those of us who are unfortunate enough to remember that episode. It also cannot be linked to the backlash of hyper-surveillance, militaristic policing, harassment, and incarceration of supposed immigrants at the borders, or of people of color in the ghettos and suburbs after events like the Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan killings in Paris, or even before that, the Danish cartoon controversy. And of course, we could cite so many more instances from the Netherlands, the UK, Germany, US, etc. It is not just the extraordinary renditions that transport suspected terrorists to places like camps in Guantanamo Bay, or the less well-known locations, one of which is the largest US military base on the stolen Chagos Islands, islands which are just south of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. Not many people know about the horrific events that took place there, but it is one of the key stories that I teach my Public Law 1 students, because it is a horrific story that is a hyper example, in a way, of modern colonialism. So as I said, it's a set of islands which are legally, and I would say illegally, a British overseas territory. The British forcibly removed the population from their homes in 1971 and dumped them to live in slums in Mauritius. And they then went on to lease that island to the US so they could create their military base. And these places, and you see the Chagossians here taking their case through the courts in the UK, these places that are, in legal terms, known as extraterritorial, are places where torture can, and we now know for sure, has taken place, outside the jurisdiction of international law. If you want to know more about this story, John Pilger has got an amazing documentary on it on his website. It's called Stealing a Nation, so I do recommend watching that. And interestingly, they have been through the courts, the Chagossian campaign group, and now Mauritius is actually in the courts against the UK, trying to declare the separation of the Chagos Islands from Mauritius when it gained independence in the 60s as an illegal act. So that's something to follow. And the fight, the continued fight of these people is really inspiring. So these stories of modern colonialism, as well as arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial killings, secret trials in this country, as well as the vile rhetoric of political parties from the Tories to UKIP, and unfortunately I live very close to a constituency which has, the only constituency which has a UKIP Member of Parliament, as well as government policies to supposedly prevent terrorism and improve social cohesion by teaching so-called British values in schools. These are all examples of state racialization. And of course, we could cite so many more examples from other Western European countries. There are, of course, other instances of Islamophobia that are not linked specifically with the state, but can be said to emanate from policies like Prevent, policies on immigration and border control, and the British values in education policy. These can be said to have incited the abuse and assault in public spaces of hijabbed women, Muslim-looking men, and people of color, including non-Muslim European immigrants in the post-Brexit era. Of course, attack on mosques and countless other examples which cut across identity and culture that are generally xenophobic. But all of these that I have cited are still not proof that Islamophobia is just a recent phenomenon, particularly if we understand that it is a form of racism, anti-Muslim racism. So in their recent book, which I saw was outside, so please do take a look at it, Masumi, Mills and Miller, like me, take the view that Islamophobia should be understood as part of racism, or what I would refer to as racialization. And many commentators, when they respond to this, have stated that Islamophobia targets religion rather than an ethnic group, and therefore they do not consider dealing with Islamophobia as part of an anti-racist agenda. But these authors argue that in reality, it overwhelmingly impacts upon ethnic minorities. Islamophobia for them is in effect racist, even if as a set of ideas it may seem or be presented as unconnected to any particular ethnic group. But the difficulty with this position is that it assumes that race is somehow more real than religion or religious identity, and a more legitimate basis for discrimination and oppression. So for this reason, because the term race itself is a fiction, as I will come on to talk about, they use the term racialization to situate contemporary Islamophobia. So if you look at the slide here, it shows what they call the 5 pillars or areas of Islamophobia, with the state being the most significant of how it can be formed. But they also argue that the other areas interact with the state. So these are not sort of standalone, but they're actually interdependent, and they work interdependently. And of course, we know from the picture of the unholy alliance here of Marie Le Pen and Geert Wilders from the so-called Freedom Party in the Netherlands, how much pushback there has been in the political scene across Western Europe as a result of the campaigning of the far right, as well as, of course, the attacks that come as a result of that. So, the logic of state Islamophobia or racism. Racialization, then, can be understood as the categorizing of people, usually non-Europeans, on the basis of supposedly biological, i.e. physical, hair color, skin color, etc., but also behavioral characteristics, social characteristics. This has been called race thinking by a body of scholars who created a field known as critical race theory. And they discuss how this kind of thinking became wrongly legitimized by 18th century European racial science studies. And you can read more about these, this supposed racial science in my book or in the work of critical race theorists. This book here is also a really good one. And it is quite shocking. For example, they link facial features, which you can see in the image there, and brain size to intelligence and behavior, and worse. And of course, this sort of science justified the European Christian colonial projects, civilizing missions from the 16th to the 19th centuries to save the native savages across the world from their beliefs and practices and ways of living deemed inferior or barbaric. And if you don't like academic texts, there's a whole body of post-colonial literature. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart is a very moving example of that literature, but there is increasingly more and more that you can read that isn't just an academic text. So ideas from racial science developed, of course, into the Eugenics Movement, which we know in the 19th century influenced Hitler's Nazism and the Holocaust. And this is, of course, a sharp reminder to us all about the dangers of what circulates as pseudoscience. But going further back than the 16th to the 19th centuries, I also discuss research that shows how racialization can be traced as far back as the Crusades. So Miles and Brown, for example, highlight how European Christian crusaders could not actually distinguish between Christians, Muslims, or Jews in the populations that they encountered on their way to conquer Jerusalem. So their massacring, their killing was indiscriminate in that way and did not pinpoint the Muslim as opposed to the Jew or the Christian. And this is something that not many of us hear about or realize. But it shows us a kind of logic of race working in that period. Another key scholar who wrote about the Middle East, in particular from the 17th century to the present, was, of course, Edward Said, author of the famous book Orientalism, which I saw outside as well. Although his analysis does not specifically use the language of racialization, but instead Orientalism, his analysis also foregrounds ways of thinking that distinguish non-Christian, non-Europeans, what he refers to as Orientals, or those from the East. And I was about to, I actually forgot I was going to crack a joke about me being the beast from the East, but anyway, I lost my moment, so. On the basis of what are perceived to be inherent biological or behavioral differences. So the term Orientalism, as coined by Said, describes actually a European discipline within academia, which developed a way of Western thought, Western studies, Western way of thinking, to understand or read the East, particularly the Middle East. So as you see from the slide, he argued that Orientalism was a system of knowledge about the Orient, offering positional authority to those espousing it. And a similar argument has been made in relation to slavery, which I will talk a bit about later as well. So by this, he meant that Western Christian academic thought had developed a systemized knowledge base. And that's really key, this systemized knowledge base, to understand and represent the Orient. This understanding also came to circulate within popular culture, including art and literature, in ways that placed Western values rooted in and interdependent with Christian values, which is a key argument I make in my book in relation to education now, as the superior civilizational apex or ideal. So just to digress for a minute, in the book I argue that this idea of British values that we should all be learning about and schools should be teaching about is actually a way to make children into a particular kind of citizen that performs in a particular way, that fits within how the government wants to see social and economic capital being produced. And these logics of what I call racial upliftment. So you're being uplifted. You're no longer being othered, but we're moving on in the contemporary time to a moment where you have the choice to be uplifted, to become part of citizenship and the polity in modern Britain. But I digress, and if you want to read more about that, and you don't want to read the book, there's also an article which I can send Lena and she can forward it to you. So, as I discuss in my book, Said's work is therefore key to understanding how non-Christianness, whether Islam or other Eastern ways of life, came to be viewed from a Christian, European, and later Western, what we now refer to as Western standpoint. And of course, the category or term race is born out of this period in history. It didn't exist before, okay? And that's something that we often We take for granted that race exists. It only exists because it was created. Yeah? So we should be really careful about how we use the term race. It was created in this particular historical moment, a fiction, a construction, in time and space, used to relegate people of color encountered through colonialization as being of a different ethnic or racial collectivity. It's a categorization and language given to that categorization. If you want to read more about that, Fanon talks about that in his book, which I will also mention a bit later as well. But you know, Said himself, God rest his soul, because he is now passed, remained optimistic and gave us a blueprint on how to exist and resist. So if the technology works, let's see if we can hear from the great scholar himself.
Gramsci, in the prison notebooks, says something that has always tremendously appealed to me, that history deposits in us our own history, our family's history, our nation's history, our tradition's history, which has left in us an infinity of traces, all kinds of marks, you know, through heredity, through collective experience, through individual experience, through family experience, through relations between one individual and another. A whole book, if you like, a series of an infinity of traces, but there's no inventory. There's no orderly guide to it. You know? So Gramsci says, therefore the task at the outset is to try to compile an inventory. In other words, to try and make sense of it. And this seems to me at any rate, to be the most interesting sort of human task. It's the task of interpretation. It's a task of giving history some shape and sense for a particular reason, not just that, you know, to show that my history is better than yours or my history is worse than yours. I'm a victim and you're somebody who's oppressed people and so on. But rather to understand my history in terms of other people's history. In other words, to try to understand, to move beyond, to generalize one's own individual experience to the experience of others. And I think the great goal is, in fact, to become someone else, to transform itself from a unitary identity to an identity that includes the other without suppressing the difference. That, he says, is the great goal. And for me, I think that would be the case, you know, and that would be the notion of writing an inventory, a historical inventory, which not only understand oneself, but understand oneself in relation to others, and to understand others as if you would understand yourself. Palestine is so important in this respect because of its local.
So he goes on to talk about how he thinks about that in the context of Palestine and Israel. But what I want you to take away from that clip really is the call to rewrite our own histories, our own versions of history, our own inventories. Sorry, I should be calling it herstory. That's my reconfiguring of it. Inventory of herstories, and not to think that there is somehow one truth about that they will always be contested, and that it's okay for us to really put that forward, and not necessarily in a confrontational way, but it can be challenging without being confrontational. It's for ourselves, to know ourselves, our families, our communities, our histories, but also to be able to engage more broadly and widely. And being an educator, that's something that I feel very passionate about and always have. Oh, no, not going there yet. So we've seen how Muslims have already been racialized from the inception of the idea of race, which, as I said, is a fiction of the European encounter with people perceived to be different from themselves. A bit like when a new type of animal is discovered and needs to be categorized by looking at its characteristics. Does anyone remember doing that in school? I remember doing that in primary school, where you had to look at the characteristics, and that's how you categorize the animal and what type it fits into. And in fact, as critical religion studies, which is a fairly new body of work, recent body of work, and very controversial, they have shown that religion as a category or term is, like race, shock horror, an invented concept by academics in the 18th century, in the same Orientalist period of knowledge-making. And, of course, it was an extension of what was happening around race and racial science in wanting to study and categorize, like categorization of animals, the different beliefs and practices of those non-Christians that they encountered. Of course, later this all develops partially into what we now know as the discipline of anthropology, and as I'm sure some of you know, that is well known for having quite a dodgy history as a discipline. So, sorry anthropologists, but anyone wanting to study anthropology, watch out. Although I have to say, when my sheikh warned me of that when I went to go and study Arabic and Persian, he's like, don't listen to what they teach you. It's all a plot against us. Bless his soul. But here is the real shocker argument. He was right, by the way. But here's the real shocker argument, as I said, and really the whole point of my book. So I put a lot of years of my life into this. And that is, like scholars Talal Asad and Masuzawa and others have shown, that the term religion is an invention of modernity. The study or discipline of religion, as I said, categorized everything it encountered into a particular kind of model. And that model, the belief and practice model, belief in a God and ritual practice to engender that belief, that has in fact become the model of how religion is understood in international human rights law, protecting religious freedom. So Article 9 for anyone who's a lawyer of the European Convention of Human Rights, for example. And of course, it was this model that other belief systems, theologies, ideologies, ways of living, what Muslims might call deen, was fitted into. So what we have here again is a Christian standpoint, Orientalist positional authority, as Said calls it, from which all non-Christian ways of being are understood, categorized, and even protected or not by law. So what I really want to highlight here, by drawing the links between Islamophobia and racism, is that what is really going on in these processes, in this continued history, is the categorization of human beings for particular disturbing and dangerous ends. Processes of categorization that dehumanize certain people in what Fanon calls in his seminal book, The Wretched of the Earth, a sentiment that described how he felt in being encountered for the first time, being seen for the first time by European colonizers, as well as later as a black man, or Negro as he terms it, on the streets of Paris. And I highlight this particular piece of work because it really captures two key elements of the process that we can call Islamophobia, racialization, Orientalism, etc. And that is, firstly, as I said, the dehumanization, and secondly, power, particularly of the state, its apparatus and links with class elites including multinational companies, because of course capitalism will not escape my vengeance. And Tamsila, this one is for you. So the dehumanization and power that are the hallmarks of contemporary state Islamophobia is really a continuation of a part of a longer historical trajectory of Euro-imperialism, featuring, as I said, Christian civilizing missions from the Crusades to colonialism. As I've highlighted, these were justified by systems of thought, whether racial science or Orientalism, and others can be traced as well. The horrific legacy of this time for the inhabitants and economies of these lands, of these colonized lands, some of which of course carry on today, can be seen from Zimbabwe, South Africa, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and I could go on forever listing the numerous instances. But I want to focus on one instance where categorization of people by colonial state power and their commercial class stooges, elite stooges, is inextricably linked to, or actually based on, totally based on the dehumanizing process of peoples. And that, of course, is in the European transatlantic slavery and its aftermath. Again, an area that is barely taught in education. Which I find very upsetting. In fact, even our own law students, so many law students, will graduate, have a law degree with no idea about how commercial law, contemporary commercial law, is rooted in a horrendous history around slavery. All that profit that has been generated comes from this history. So the slaves were dehumanized, as we all know, being considered property, chattels of slave owners, commodities that could be bought and sold, worked to death, literally, in sugar and tobacco plantations, dispensed with abhorrently like animals or specimens. And in fact, if you look at some of the case law, it actually refers to slaves as cargo, like horses. And parallels can be drawn, of course, with later use of forced labor, even after slavery was officially abolished. And of course, the British took the credit for being the main abolitionists and supposedly stopping the slave trade with the 1833 Abolition of Slavery Act. But the full history of this period is relatively unknown and certainly not publicized or even taught about in universities, as I said, outside of the few Black studies or critical race religion modules that exist. And I do run a critical race religion module and law module, as Halima said, and but it's really tough, actually, because the students, you don't want to demoralize them, but actually most of the students of color just are blown away by it, really blown away by it. So it's a necessary task, but it is a hard task to use this information or to learn about this information and then remobilize yourself. But anyway, I'll come on to that after. So the British took the credit for being the abolitionists and supposedly stopping the slave trade with that particular act. And it was not these arguments that were made in Parliament. When you look at the transcripts of the parliamentary debates are very interesting, because the arguments made for the abolition of slavery were not on what you would think human worth, moral arguments, but actually on the basis of commercial arguments, because of course the propertied slave owners were the ruling class at the time. And the Quakers and the previous slaves who had managed to come here and were campaigning on it had to stay away. They could not even go and be seen to be watching the debates in Parliament. They were told not to be associated with it in order to give it a full chance to actually get through. And I could carry on telling you stories about that, but I can send you links if you're interested in reading more about that. So we do not know the full story of how slavery forms an integral part of the fabric of this country and its current capitalist system. The perpetuation of a racialized class system, the basis of protection in commercial law for profits over people. And of course, you know, there is the whole movement against capitalism and all of that, but we don't very often hear about the racialized and gendered as well as other aspects of the anti-capitalist movement. So many companies, many multinationals have played a role and benefited from slavery, and yet fail to acknowledge that history. They have been called out, but their comments are really quite appalling and shocking, just bland, you know, it doesn't touch anything. They do not make any recompense or compensation, but rather continue socio-economic inequalities, as we've seen. And here you have to sort of herald the work of people like Justice for the Janitors movement in the US. But then again, they don't really get much leadership leadership from the former Prime Minister of this country, David Cameron, who did not set a good example when on his trip to Jamaica, where he was asked about slavery and reparations, and he barely mustered an apology, but of course brushed off the issue of reparations for slavery, and instead, what did he offer? Because of course he wanted to offer something because he felt so bad about it. So he offered to build prisons so that Jamaicans that were in the UK could be returned and be incarcerated there instead. How very generous of you, Mr. Cameron. I could say so much more about this, but time limits me today. But what I do want to highlight is that these stories are being retold, as Edward Said told us to do. These histories are being retold and rewritten, and I urge you to be part of that movement. So I talked about modern capitalism, and there's a wonderful book by David Scott called Conscripts of Modernity, and he talks about how slavery demonstrates dehumanization with capitalism, and how that gives rise to us all being conscripted into the modern capitalist agenda. And of course, we see that in Mahmoud Mamdani's book, which I also saw outside, and what he calls the good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy. Those progressive Muslims who integrate, participate as citizens, produce social as well as economic capital, they are, of course, the good Muslims who are welcome, mostly, as opposed to those who become radicalized or bludgeon off the state. Again, you see the logics of capitalism, class, and race coming together, and we need to resist that narrative. We will not continue to be categorized or have our children educated in this categorizing way. My kids' school hate me, by the way. But luckily, my partner's even worse than me, so actually, I get to play the good cop sometimes. Right. 5 minutes. Okay, good. I'm on my last slide. So, how do we tackle Islamophobia, and what now? Well, the Runnymede Trust, which is the leading race equality think tank in this country, published a report on Islamophobia in 2017. And incidentally, they also refer to Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism. And that report makes 10 recommendations. It's available on their website for free, so you can have a look at it. And it is, of course, being a think tank, mainly aimed at the state. And they include points that you would expect to see in these recommendations, things like asking the government to review its counter-terrorism legislation, stop and search, etc. But there are 2 points in that report that I found particularly interesting. So the first was them calling for a greater awareness of how Islamophobia and all forms of racism affect people's lives in modern Britain. So bringing them together. And secondly, for the government to reintroduce a target to reduce child poverty, develop a wider anti-poverty strategy. Why? Because half of all Bangladeshi and Pakistani children live in poverty in this country. And given that the rates of poverty among Muslims generally are much higher than average, tackling poverty, they say, would greatly improve the lives and outcomes for British Muslims. Preventing poverty is especially important, they say, for children, not just morally, but also because it is a good preventative strategy for reducing inequalities in later life, and this is where I might depart a bit, improving integration. Not sure if that's code for and they're less likely to become radicalized, but anyway, we'll put that to one side. On a serious note, I think that highlighting the socio-economic dimension, disadvantage, is really key to the activism that we all need to be part of. And not just for what we perceive as our communities, but for all across the board. So what that requires, as I've said, is educating ourselves, events such as these, finding out about the detail of how racialization and racism work in conjunction with capitalism, to create and perpetuate gendered forms of poverty, lack of access to education, employment, and so on. I know from personal experience that I'm only where I'm at. I'm actually amazed sometimes that I managed to get to where I'm at, because many times over I didn't think I would make it. Many times over, I was lucky enough to have people to drag me through, and still my confidence gets bashed by obstacles, processes. And it is only through solidarity across the board that enables us to really transcend these socio-economic and other barriers. And we know from the most recent Runnymede report on intersecting inequalities that austerity and its cut to benefits, including for those who are employed, affect Black and Asian women, and out of those, Bangladeshi and Pakistani women the most. So what we can do is mobilize ourselves at all different levels, interacting with the state more directly in political and legal campaigning, demos, etc., at a national and local level. And I want to give a special shout out actually to those Muslim women, over 100 of them, that signed a letter to protest against the decision by a head teacher of a primary school in Newham, who recently, it was January, to ban the headscarf for Muslim children in that school. An action which was no doubt inspired by my nemesis, the Ofsted Chief Inspector, and her comments are going against her own agenda of British values in school. Of course, it's convenient for them one time, but then, you know, freedom and liberation and mutual respect and all of that, not at other times or for other people. So those of us who are parents, and even those who are not, must lobby these schools constantly, resist giving them data which they then go on and feed into the prevent machine, and demand an inclusive education. I would give a funny example, but because I'm being recorded, I can't, so. Away from the state institutions, we must also come together to start initiatives like IMI or social enterprises, artistic collectives, reading and study groups, archives and inventories of our herstories, where we can build our own capacities and skills together, as well as mobilize and socialize, eat and pray. But this should be done across issues, as I said, taking that intersectional approach. And I'm particularly passionate about that. One that does not separate the socioeconomic disadvantages and marginalization associated with race, religion, gender, sexuality, age, dis/ability, but takes people as whole and unique beings with points of connection. And that is, for me, is the basis of solidarity and mobilization. And of course, these are some of the pictures that I hope you can see that kind of idea coming out. Nothing is set in stone, and even structural formations of disadvantage can change and shift. So I've been, you know, I've talked about a lot of horrible things, but I want to end on an optimistic note. And I do truly believe that things can shift and change, not in a linear form where they're always going to go, you know, get better, but with regressions, and those regressions should not knock us down entirely. We can be knocked down for a while, and then we have to pull each other back up. Things can change and shift in the interaction between the state apparatus, institutions, and civil society actors like us. So even though I've been talking about structural racism and racialization, that I still think, as do many others, that that is an interaction and it is shifting and can change. So the civil rights movement in the US, amongst countless other social movements, are testimony to that. And of course, that wasn't the end of the road for the civil rights movement, was it? Because now, of course, we have Black Lives Matter. A movement started to try and tackle the police shootings of people of color and the resurgence of white supremacy. So even though the road may have little end in sight, we must walk, run, jog, crawl, ride, or be taken down it, one way or another, but certainly together. Thank you.
I think it's actually rare in our kind of British context to have that kind of rich history that you traced us through. So linking back to the Crusades, that kind of colonial legacy, and along that trajectory, how Islamophobia is part of a much deeper context than we often talk about it and hear about it in the UK. And I guess a broad question to open with. So I'll ask a couple of questions and then I'm just going to throw it out to you all. But to open with, how absent do you see that history that we have to place Islamophobia in if we're truly to tackle it and engage with it effectively? How absent do you see that being in the media and in policy conversations in the UK today?
Almost completely, entirely absent, yeah. I mean, I mentioned that I have 2 children in school, and my second one is in secondary school, and so far all she gets from me is counter-narratives. Yeah. So, you know, they did Queen Victoria and how wonderful she was in the British Empire, and she got a complete, you know, counter-narrative from me. And, you know, even things like going into schools and the gendering of girls and boys, and resisting that as well. And then up to higher education, which is obviously where I am now, and well, even before I went into the university and when I was working in practice. And actually, one of the reasons why I moved to the university was because the actual campaigning was exhausting and very demoralizing, and I needed time to think about the ethics of how I was mobilizing and my activism, and how to continue that if it was possible. So yeah.
No, and thank you for that today, because I think in this kind of narrow and reductive climate that we often find ourselves sitting in terms of the messaging, the mainstream narratives, it's so necessary to have those resources, to have some of the resources that Suhraiya mentioned that we can all look up afterwards, and to take these conversations forward. And we're lucky today with Inclusive Mosque to have a space where we can have these conversations. And as Halima was saying, a big objective of today is to bring these conversations out of this room after today and continue them in different ways and bring them to our respective campaigns and spaces. Yeah. And then another question is, as Halima again mentioned in the introduction, Suhraiya does a lot of work around anti-racist and post-colonial queer theory. So today we're thinking about Islamophobia in the context, in our workshops of education, the media and borders. We haven't made a space to think about Islamophobia through the lens of specifically gender or sexuality. So something that I'm particularly thinking of is the way that gender is often instrumentalized as a way to channel Islamophobia. So whether it's interventions, whether it's Iraq and Afghanistan, the way women's rights are invoked, to the idea that Islam is kind of regressive, the kind of barbaric, uncivilized, and in the same way how LGBT rights are often used in political agendas. Some of you might have heard the term Homo Nationalism, this idea that, that there's a kind of, that you can, political agendas that could be against immigration, that are racist, that are Islamophobic, and they're justified in the terms of LGBT identity and rights. How then, with the idea that Islam is innately homophobic, that is, so how then, and in the process of doing that, queer Muslim identity is, again, as often it is erased and sidelined. So how do you see that operating as a site of Islamophobia and a channel?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've written a piece which is in a book called Decolonising Sexualities. Unfortunately, I was snowed out of my office, so I couldn't bring books with me today. But you can access it on a pay what you can afford basis online, actually. And it's a collection of work that brings together fiction, non-fiction, academic pieces, essays, artwork, that really talks about the multiplicities of oppression and discrimination, and in particular socioeconomic disadvantage. But how working, and I think the thing that really comes out of that project is how working across issues is really key to moving the political agenda forward or pushing education forward, whatever location, wherever you are. And so, yeah, I stick to that kind of approach, really. That's what I've pretty much learned in terms of being strategic. Because whatever, I used to work in anti-discrimination in practice and campaign for changes in the law. And, you sometimes you're successful, and at the time, I could be really happy about certain changes in the law that came about. The Equalities Act, for example, I worked on that, which came into force in 2010. But it's now been nearly 10 years, and I've just been doing a survey of case law, 10 years worth of case law, and there's barely anything. So this intersectional approach to equalities is practically non-existent. And the Act doesn't actually put into force the clause that we pushed for, which was to think about socioeconomic disadvantage. But if it did, that would tackle, not that I want to reify or place law as the site where change can happen, because it rarely does. I actually believe that grassroots is much more important. But that has really shown me that it's really important to work across issues at different levels.
Yeah, and with the work specifically around the kind of queer identity and Islamophobia, you've done some really interesting work around that.
Yeah, so in that piece, in that book, I talk about how there were stickers in the East End of London that someone put round saying, I can't remember what it was now, even though I wrote an article on it.
It's probably for the best.
But basically, they were perceived as homophobic stickers put up by Muslims. And so a bunch of what turned out to be basically far-right EDL supporters wanted to set up this march through the East End. And what happened was a collection of organizations coming together, gay organizations as well as anti-racism ones and local community ones that actually exposed the far-right elements and stopped that march from going ahead and took account of the migrant history and the poverty of that area. And in 2016, we celebrated 80 years since the Cable Street riots in the East End of London, which was, of course, an epitomized moment of racist hate in this country.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Suhraiya. Right, I'm going to take questions now from the room. So if we start off, we've got a question there. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Zina. I think one of the challenges of challenging Islamophobia within the Muslim community is that, from what I noticed, the Muslim community is so heavily divided. Like, our communities are very sectarian. Like, for example, a lot of, like, in the masjid, like, the Sunni Muslims won't really associate with the Shi'i Muslims, and like, there's, like, like, apparently, according to a friend of mine, a student at SOAS, it's like the Ahmadi society doesn't really associate with the other Muslim societies. And it's not only sectarian, but also very classist as well. Like, middle-class families only associate with other middle-class families. And I think with this division, it's actually so difficult to mobilize and actually properly challenge Islamophobia properly. So how can we deal with the intersectional hierarchies with our communities? What do you think is a solution?
All right, so I'm probably not going to give you an answer that you're going to like. Because, I grew up with that same scenario. My mother is a Sunni and my father is a Shiite, and it was cat and dog between the two sides of the family, which mosque you go to, which kind of Muslim you are, and all of that. And I hated it for a long time. But what it has given me is a real richness in my life, and an understanding that there are different perspectives and ways of seeing things. And actually, you just got to love them. They're going through, they've come to this country and they've struggled and they're doing the best they can. They're not perfect, they are fallible, but you just got to give them leeway and, push through where you can, drip, 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 and then give yourself a break, and then come here and chillax, and then go, once you're rejuvenated, go back and fight another front. And I heard Lemon Sissay, the black poet, speak at my university on Tuesday as part of the Equality, Diversity, Inspirational Speakers series. And he was taken from his birth mother and not returned to her, even though she pleaded for him to be. And he was then put in a family who were going to adopt him, and then they rejected him, and he was then went through the care system. And he said, which really, really moved me on Tuesday, that family is just a collection of disputed memories. It's a thing, and he literally goes, it's a thing, you carry it like a thing, and the way he performs it is so amazing. But you know what? You're lucky because you've got this thing. You've got this thing, whereas he doesn't have that. And not everyone has that. So actually this thing, the angst, the harassment within your families and communities and being fed up and all of that, it's a thing that we can learn to love and cherish and mobilize at the right moment.
Yeah, and I also think on that point that Inclusive Mosque could be a really interesting space, because that's true, and that is a barrier to having conversations around continuity. This idea of a united ummah in that context is not true. It's difficult to have those conversations. Inclusive Mosque, the idea of this space is that it is an inclusive space of worship for all Muslims, for marginalised Muslims, for Muslims who go to other spaces but come here as well. And it could be a really interesting place to have these conversations in a way that we haven't been able to before. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Hamia, over there? Yeah.
Hi, I'd like to just go back to the historical and geographical frame of your presentation. So,
I'm not a historian, I should say.
Sorry. No, there's two significant global actors in terms of Islamophobia today. One of them would be the rise of the Hindu nationalism and the BJP and Modi, and the Gujarat genocide, which killed several British citizens, and Priti Patel, who's the head of the BJP diasporic branch, who's in the cabinet. And does this framework of European colonialism, how does it fit into it? Does it risk overlooking that? And the other significant historical geographical framework is Serbian nationalism and the Bosnian genocide, that's very much not, that's within Europe, but the Serbs and also the Golden Dawn and probably Russian Islamophobia see themselves as decolonial. They see themselves as resistance to a dominating Turkish NATO alliance and Turkish imperialism, and they use that to justify genocide and mass rape. And we shouldn't underestimate how influential that is in terms of Andrzej Breivik in his manifesto references Bosnia over 300 times as a reason, and also Robert Spencer, who's the key ideologue of Pamela Geller and EDL, also takes this geography. So how do we fit that into the framework of European colonialism, and do we risk overlooking those two very significant players?
Yeah. Let me take another question while I mull that one over.
Great. Yeah, question at the front here.
Hi, I'd just like to... Just 1 second, sorry. Hi, sorry. I have a problem with the term Islamophobia, and I've often wondered, is it because it is, as you said, it's rooted in racism. Has there not been any groups or movements to try and change the name? Because I've spoken to Sikhs and Hindus, and they get targeted. Yet there's tensions between the South Asian communities as well. But for the white community, we're all the same.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll deal with that question first because that's a bit more straightforward. So I mentioned the Equalities Act, and that was actually part of the aim of that was to bring protection or to bring religion into the purview of protection. And in taking an intersectional approach, you could work across these categories of race and religion, etc. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked in the way that we kind of had envisaged it to, but religion does have some protection in the law now that it didn't have prior to that, so it was only race, and that did cover, so the Race Relations Act, that did cover Judaism and Sikhism, but it didn't cover Islam and Rastafarianism and other things. But of course you do have criminal laws around hate crimes that could be used. But I find those are problematic, so...
No, but just to create a mass movement of, bringing other communities in, because Muslims are not going to be able to tackle this themselves.
Well, that's why I'm saying...
So using the word Islamophobia...
Yeah. So that's why using being part of a broader anti-racist movement or anti-capitalist movement that takes account of race and the different aspects of it is basically what I'm arguing for.
But Muslims, I find that there's a lot of, like Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, they won't get involved in any of these other things.
Yeah.
Movements for anti-austerity. They'll come along to an Islamophobia event, but they'll not get involved in Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. But it takes all sorts, and it doesn't. That doesn't mean that there isn't other. Just existing is a daily fight, and taking account of the labour of Pakistani and Bangladeshi women, that is not part of what is recognised in the formal economy, is also a massive fight that can be seen as part of tackling Islamophobia. So there's plenty of battles out there that people can get involved in. Right, let me tackle this geopolitical conundrum that you've placed me. You've got 2 PhD projects there. But you're absolutely right to highlight that it's not as simple as I have presented it. What I have presented is a hugely reductive simplification of what is a horrendous geopolitical nightmare. And of course, Muslims are not free of blame from this either. We are part of, the social actors that we mentioned that feed into those structures. Of course, the Arabs were involved in slavery as well. So let's not, pat ourselves on the back too much and say we're free of vice, so to speak, and that the picture is becoming ever increasingly complicated and from different spheres. I think, in terms of like going back to India and what you said, it's, there is work being done that can trace this far-right BJP kind of movement. As you saw with Mugabe in Zimbabwe, this kind of post-colonial, I was about to swear, but I realized I couldn't, screw up, mash up, mess. And it's about not allowing those in power to say, well, this is what you're doing, and you're not being a good citizen, and you're not fitting in, and you're not integrating. And actually challenging that narrative and its historical trajectory that has come about. And that has to be done in multiple contexts, including in India, including challenging us here and pushing our government here to challenge that, but without them letting them get away with being the savior. Although, with Theresa May, she went to China and she didn't even bring up human rights. Is that a good thing or a bad thing now? I'm totally confused. We didn't want her to go around proselytizing about human rights, but we also don't want her to jump into bed with, all sorts of capitalist actors that are colonizing whole parts of East Africa and taking up the whole economy there and taking the poor people who are living there back to times of slavery. So I have some students from there, and it's really quite horrific. Okay, some easier questions, please.
Hopefully this one will be more straightforward. So I attend a university where a master's around critical race was completely shut down. So I was really interested to hear how it was possible for you to develop that module. How did it happen? How did you manage to keep it going for, I don't know how long it's been going for, but yeah, that's what I'm really interested to hear.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, actually, because, in many ways, I'm lucky because my law school markets itself as a critical law school. So I have a kind of head start there. Having said that, it's still a push and you still need the students. So you still have to work towards the kind of marketization model. But for some reason, the module started out small and it was oversubscribed, and I was lucky that I could just expand it and now take it to master's level as well. So it's really about students saying, this is what I want to hear about. So, and noticing that there are some people writing and thinking and nagging about these issues, and then, you know, gravitating towards them. And that's how it happened for me as well. I gravitated to certain people who were working on these issues, and that's how it, you know, gets bigger and bigger, although it is constantly under threat. And unfortunately, I do now have to place the rationale or justification for it, not in terms of pedagogy, but in terms of, you know, market. Are there enough students for it? And what's the demand for it? And I hate that. It kills me. But, you know, sometimes you have to dance with the devil to get a bit further on. And there's a line that you have to draw, and I have drawn it at other areas. But, yeah, because I'm passionate about more people understanding these histories and the contemporary formations and engaging with the complications rather than going, oh, we're all screwed and let's just, you know, we can't do anything about it, so we'll just participate. That really is very sad to see.
Okay, we're running a little bit over, but we've got time for one more question. Is there a question?
So yeah, come and study at my university. Come and apply.
Come hither. Fahad, last question.
Thanks a lot. This was really interesting. You mentioned a little bit about the educational system and the dynamics of anti-Muslim and sort of racist, Islamophobic politics, specifically in the recent event about, you know, the primary school, was it in the hijab ban, and the media dynamics around it. It was really, it tore me into sort of like camps within myself. One part that firmly believes that certain forms of socializing of gender norms, like you were also talking about in the middle, can have to be challenged, have to be talked about, while the other side is about the use of critical thought to oppress minorities and to sort of like be the champions of human rights, to actually, when we were talking about Homo Nationalism and all of that, to perpetuate inequality rather than to counter it. So how do we, people who want to talk about, let's say feminism, talk about sexualities and the rights of minorities within minorities, what languages and what idiom can be used which doesn't help the people who use this language in Islamophobia as well? How do we talk about minorities within minorities without perpetuating Islamophobia?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, a really important question. First of all, you have to be true to yourself and use the language that you are comfortable with, and resist anyone placing language upon you that you're not comfortable with, or identifying in a way that you're not comfortable with. And yeah, it's a slog. You have to be able to then decide, you know, where you're going to have your battles around using that language, and where you'll just let it slide. You can't win every battle. You have to be kind to yourself. Let's be realistic about it. And, you know, again, it's about gathering a critical mass of people, so those who are like-minded with you, who want to use similar language to you, and moving on from there. But like I said before, using the language of intersectionality, which is how things come together and how they become formations. Not ones that are completely then, you know, so structured that they cannot change, but dialoguing with people that you can dialogue with. Some people you just can't, you know? You can't. And I wrote about one case where the judge said, I just can't understand. So he knew he wasn't getting the situation there, and he just said, in his judgment, I'm a white judge and I just don't understand. So you know what, credit to the guy. He doesn't get it, but at least he knows he doesn't get it. You know, and sometimes that's as good as you can get. And take that, take it. Take whatever you can get and celebrate those moments, because they need to refuel you to battle the harder moments, the harder battles.
And I think on that, Fahad, just quickly before lunch, it is so difficult, and it is that kind of, the idea of maintaining that complexity is a massive part of that. But of course, a lot of people can't fathom the complexity of our identities, of our lives, and of how things navigate around that. And I work for an organisation, Maslaha, where we work with social inequalities in Muslim communities that do cut across those socioeconomic inequalities. So we talk about, you know, gender, we talk about housing, we talk about criminal justice, we talk about mental health. But of course, that makes for a really complicated picture. But you can't talk about mental health or criminal justice system without talking about all the other things. And then for us as an organisation, and that means it's harder to get funding, it's harder to get support, it's easier to be co-opted, it's easier for simple stories to be drawn from a more complicated picture. And I think it is that thing about using the language of intersectionality and, you know, and making sure that our stories are clear and our voices are clear. That's a big part of it, I think, like Suhraiya has done today. You can't co-opt something that's been said on those terms if you can get a platform to do that.
I mean, we're not, you know, as a sort of a wider community, we're not really set up by our families and our mosques and things to be strategic and savvy in the sorts of skills that you need. You know, you can become a doctor, engineer, whatever. My son wants to become all of those, by the way. And but you don't have those other skills, and that's what I realized, that you know, I'm intelligent, but I don't have all these skills that all these white people have to get forward. How do I get them? And you trial and error, and eventually I learned some, and sometimes I went beyond what I was comfortable with ethically, and sometimes I didn't go far enough. And your life is a process of learning what your barrier is, your ethical barrier, but also at the same time getting those strategic skills, capacity building with other like-minded people, and bloody going for it. Yeah. Live the life you want to live, that you are meant to live.
Woo! Okay, on that note, lunch has been served in the hall. Yeah, okay, go ahead, Olivia. Thank you, Suhraiya.